A few months ago, I was inspired by a conversation on YouTube between five people organized by Nate Higgins, a podcaster and university professor. It was called The Ecology of Communication, Moving Beyond Polarization in Service of Life. As a couples therapist who gets to witness the patterns of communication between life partners on a daily basis, I often marvel at how these are supposed to be our best relationships of all, and yet they are so often fraught with conflict. I couldn't help but ask myself what's going on beneath the surface here. Now, these folks in the video were looking at a macrocosm like our political discourse, while I'm usually looking at a microcosm of an intimate relationship in my profession. But I've noticed the same patterns exist in both of these spheres. As above, so below. Before I go any further, I just want to introduce myself. I'm Nate Cokernow, a father of two teenagers. I'm a guy who had a midlife crisis about a decade ago in the form of a divorce that catapulted me towards a spiritual awakening since then. I switched from a career in carpentry to a career in therapy, which required 4 more years of school. I consider myself to be a spiritually guided therapist. Part of why I'm here is to publicize a book I've written called How to Change the World by Changing Your Mind, and I hope that it will be published sometime in 2025. I'm a devoted student of A Course in Miracles. This is a book that belongs in the psychology section just as well as in the spirituality section. It's a spiritual textbook of sorts, in that it has a text, a workbook, and a manual for teachers, and I should also mention that it was a channeled work. The voice that dictated A Course in Miracles claimed to be Jesus, and most of the followers of the Course do believe, as I do, that it was, and that Jesus is with us to this day. One thing it explains in depth is precisely why we struggle with communication so much, and it does so in the most logical and meaningful way that I've ever come across. By the way, if you've heard of Marianne Williamson, who is one of the obscure also-rans in the last 2 Democratic Party presidential cycles, she's probably the world's most renowned teacher of A Course in Miracles today. So I wanted to explore some of the principles of communication that they discussed in the Ecology of Communication video and compare them with the principles discussed in A Course in Miracles. Like Nate Hagen's group, I am aware of the fact that our world is slipping into a more chaotic phase right now. Thanks to A Course in Miracles, I don't believe that suffering is real, but I do know the experience of suffering firsthand, and having found it very unpleasant, I don't wish it on anyone. Whether it's real or not, it's an experience that feels real for the person having it, and that elicits my compassion. I also agree with these folks that looking at how we communicate and investigating whether it is in alignment with certain ecological truths about nature would be a sane and reasonable first step to finding an effective prescription to reduce the amount of unnecessary conflict and suffering that may emerge from this current episode of dis-ease. If we start to see communication as a system and as something that has an ecology just like in nature, we can learn how to communicate better. So the principles I'm going to talk about today could be looked at as premises or axioms for an equation for effective communication, which I am presenting for your thoughtful consideration. The first principle I'd like to discuss is what Rex Weiler, who's one of the co-founders of Greenpeace, mentioned in the video, about looking to how nature solves its problems when he is confronted with a problem himself. Instead of giving examples of what this might look like, I'm going to try to justify the practice itself in metaphysical terms from A Course in Miracles, which says, quote, "The world is nothing in itself. Your mind must give it meaning, and what you behold upon it are your wishes acted out so you can look on them and think them real." Essentially, this is saying that what you are experiencing as the world is actually a projection of your inner nature and your inner desires onto a blank screen. If nature is nothing more than a reflection of our nature, it's a great place to look for solutions to our problems. Next, I'd like to talk about the forgotten art of listening. It's an element of communication that is crucial to proper understanding. We all have mental maps for various ideas or thought systems. If you and I are talking about budgeting, for example, I have a mental map of that realm that is comprised of all my past experiences with the topic. My mental map includes facts about budgeting, like checking accounts, savings accounts, credit cards, debt. There are principles and values that I hold in my mental map, and explanations, perhaps due to my personality, for why I make the decisions around budgeting the way I do. You have your own mental map of budgeting, and the roads on our maps are not all in the same locations. There are destinations on my map, like cities and towns, that don't exist on your map as of yet, and there are some destinations and roads on yours that don't exist on mine. If person B were to repeat back what they heard person A say, this is a practice known as active listening, person A might notice some discrepancies in how they each got to that point. There's a name for this phenomenon in the world of debate. It's called straw manning. It's defined cynically as, quote, misrepresenting someone's argument to make it easier to refute or dismiss, end quote. On the surface, it does appear to be an intellectually dishonest practice, but I like to think of it as a natural tendency because of this simple fact that we do have different mental maps or constructs in our heads of the topics being discussed. But it's still a barrier for effective communication that needs correcting. One of the things that makes communication go off the rails, in my experience as a couples counselor, is the sense that both people usually have that they are not being seen and understood. This is where big emotions often get triggered and where communication breaks down. Now, if person A is talking about a certain aspect of budgeting that is significant to them, which they really want to be understood, they will explain that part again, and person B can repeat back what they hear until person A feels satisfied they were understood correctly. Person A corrects for the discrepancies, and person B repeats back what they hear until they are both satisfied that they're on the same page. This simple correction for unintended straw manning has a name in the podcasting world. It's called steel manning, which is defined as, quote, presenting the strongest, most charitable version of someone's argument to engage with it fairly. Now, this takes a lot longer because you really have to understand someone's argument fully, which means truly understand the roads in their mental map to understand the logic of their argument. When you do this and you repeat it back to them, they usually feel understood, which often brings with it a huge sigh of relief. They also feel more inclined to listen to you. Communication, when done in this way, is a collaborative process rather than a competitive process, because shared understanding is the shared purpose of the communication. There may still be disagreement, but at least we agree about what we're disagreeing about. This will make the communication much more efficient and less emotionally triggering for all. The first step in steel manning is the acknowledgement that you're straw manning. You can't consciously choose to stop doing something that you're not aware you're doing. Straw manning is just a phenomena which we're all prone to, that must be understood and seen before it can be corrected. It's not a sign that you're a bad person, but it is a barrier to constructive communication simply because you're not on the same page when you're straw manning. You do not understand what you're arguing against. Here's a quote from A Course in Miracles. You can't behave appropriately unless you perceive accurately. The idea that appropriate behavior depends on correct perception seems obvious when you think about the garden hose that gets mistaken for a snake. Now say you're misperceiving the intentions of someone else because your mental maps are out of line. Then in a very literal sense, you cannot possibly react appropriately. A Course in Miracles suggests that we should take accountability for our mistaken perceptions rather than our behavior, because our mistakes in behavior were rooted in our mistaken perceptions of what is really going on. The third principle that they discussed in the video extensively on the podcast was that everything is related to everything else in a complex web of cause and effect. There's consensus among the ecologists that this is how it works in nature, and Nate and company also see that it works this way in the ecology of communication as well. When we think about problems in a linear way, we are disregarding unintended possibilities that could have been avoided if we had looked at it more holistically. This runs parallel to A Course in Miracles' definition for justice. Quote, salvation is God's justice. It restores to your awareness the wholeness of the fragments you perceive as broken off. End quote. In this light, A just solution could be seen as one which recognizes everyone's inherent equality as God's creations, emphasizing fairness. In other words, the solution isn't just unless it works for everyone. That might seem impossible to achieve. For these folks, and for myself, it isn't impossible so much as it is an absolutely necessary prerequisite for any long-lasting solution. It has to work like this to be just. Obviously, the first realization that springs from this is that just solutions are not quick fixes. Linear thinking provides the quick fixes, but they turn out more like a game of whack-a-mole, with new unintended problems springing up all over the place. Part of what this looks like in practice would be bringing more voices into every conversation. So say we've got an economic problem. We don't just talk to the industrialists and the economists. We talk to the historians and hear their perspective, and the social scientists, and the natural scientists, and the anthropologists, and the working people who will be impacted by the decision. We might need someone to explain how this will impact our relationship with Mexico or Canada, as it most likely does. If we see that our solution to this problem is going to have unintended impact on the lives of black people more than white people, or people from a certain neighborhood, then we talk to representatives from those communities. We start with the idea that the chain of cause and effect of any decision reaches in all directions and far past our field of vision. And we use our intuition to imagine where it might go. And bring in the people who know more than we do about those many systems it will impact. That brings us to our fourth shared principle: have conversations that are life-affirming. Whether we view nature as a competitive struggle or as a cooperative process is up to each of us individually. Perhaps the competitive elements of nature get folded into an order that affirms life's regeneration. It certainly appears that way. Regardless, life does seem to go on in nature as long as nature is there. We can see for ourselves that nature maintains balance somehow. It finds order in chaos, or it wouldn't exist, because clearly there's a lot of chaos bubbling up all the time. Appreciation of this principle brings grace to the forefront. It's an admission that communication is messy, but also doable. If I walk into this conversation, one in which I have expectations of disagreement, with a trust and faith that these principles found in nature will create order through the chaos, then I'm positioning myself as a good faith negotiator. My trusting in the other person's good intentions is also a prerequisite for effective communication. And I'm willing to speak up when I see a lack of shared understanding that might need to be corrected for. If the purpose of the communication is to seek a solution that works for everybody, then everybody must be heard and understood. This brings us to the principle from before about justice. The solution must be affirming of all life, so it must be inclusive, which speaks to diversity. In nature, we can see that diversity is a life-affirming principle. We can see, for instance, how communities that are genetically diverse are more resilient to novel viruses. To me, this is clear indication that diversity is life-affirming. We can assume that solutions that don't promote diversity then are probably misdirected. This is also how it works in your gut. If you don't have a rich ecosystem of microorganisms in your gut, then your immunity is challenged. Ideas that lessen diversity will literally be a step in the direction of sickness and dysfunction for the system as a whole. Another principle brought up in the Ecology of Communication is to pay attention to the emergent. Now, what does that mean? Right now is when things are happening. In the past, the things have already happened, and in the future, they haven't happened yet. But things are currently happening, and so let's focus on that. That's the emergent. There's a principle that I found out about recently called the free energy principle that I'll talk about much more in later videos, but I want to touch on it now. The free energy principle describes the dance between order and chaos, and how the drama between them unfolds right at the boundary between the past and the present and the future. That's a little flash of time that we know as the present moment. Within every system there is both a bigger force that is seeking order and harmony. You could call it the establishment if you like, or the norm. And there are accidentals, surprises, variations, and fluctuations that create chaos at the emergent level. But the order is always being restored at the same time as more chaos is emerging. I'm going to use something that emerged for me this morning to illustrate this point. I wanted a break from writing, so I opened up Spotify and saw a new single from an artist I liked named Sharon Van Etten. With her latest album, she decided to write all the songs in collaboration with her band for the first time, and this is what she described happening as a result. Quote, "Sometimes it's exciting, sometimes it's scary, sometimes you feel stuck. It's like every day feels a little different. Just being at peace with whatever you're feeling and whoever you are and how you relate to people in that moment. If I can just keep a sense of openness while knowing that my feelings change every day, that is all I can do right now. That and try to be the best person I can be while letting other people be who they are and not taking it personally. Just being. I'm not there, but I'm trying to be there every day." End quote. Aspiring to this ideal of open-mindedness is what she's speaking of here. For everyone, there's a lot more that we don't know than we do know. When we meet the present moment without expectations of what it will be, we can surf the free energy rather than drown in it. We allow for the messiness as well as for the moments of connection. We celebrate the idea that because person A said this, a related thought sprung up in person B's mind that adds to the conversation in a surprising and unexpected way, and we can both marvel at the miracle that emerged from it. We build off of each other. We co-create reality. We can peek into another system, natural selection, to see some of the hidden gems of free energy in the present, emergent moment. Natural selection is itself a life-affirming process. It's basically nature's algorithm for keeping organisms in alignment with the changes to the environment. Sometimes accidents happen in the form of genetic mutations. Some of the accidents turn out to be unfortunate, and some of them turn out to be necessary adjustments to the environmental changes. The same thing happens in communication. Accidents emerging from free energy in the form of emotions, misunderstandings, and conflict get resolved into shared understandings through applying tools like active listening. When we're surfing the free energy instead of drowning in it, we get a broader perspective on the whole scene. We begin to handle conflict and surprises with more grace and patience. Another idea touched on in the Ecology of Communication was an acknowledgment of our limiting factors. One such factor is language. Language is vulnerable to misinterpretation, which can often be the unintended cause for misunderstanding. In A Course in Miracles, he says, quote, "Words are but symbols of symbols, twice removed from reality," end quote. Acknowledging and accepting this limitation of language allows us the grace to appreciate the need to slow down communication and correct for free energy or misunderstandings as we forge ahead. The words are imperfect representations of the ideas or images they're pointing at, but if we're patient and we use these tools, we develop a sense of trust that we can get over these hurdles. Other limitations we can accept and acknowledge are our split wills. We're all divided approximately in half with regard to a key belief, the belief being that we are either one connected being or separate beings that are disconnected from everything. It sure feels that way sometimes. I'm suggesting that the very idea of an individual is an illusionary construct that we invented ourselves. A Course in Miracles says, quote, "The major problem that you have is the continuing split will, which naturally interferes with your true identification," end quote. The idea that we are separate is the key premise of the ego thought system, and the ego acts a lot like gravity, in that it's very hard to pull away from entirely. Understanding the gravity of the ego can also allow us more grace when we are trying to communicate with it. Accepting that sometimes communication is impossible is part of harnessing this principle. According to A Course in Miracles, the Holy Spirit and the ego don't agree on a single thing. When person A is under the guidance of the Holy Spirit and person B is being guided by the ego, no real communication is possible, meaning nothing gets created. I don't mean ever, just right now while these conditions persist. So you might assess the situation and determine now isn't the right time to try. It will be a wasted effort. That doesn't mean it won't be possible in 20 minutes after we calm down, or maybe this weekend. This is a nice segue into the next principle discussed in the video. Try not to form expectations of the outcome. And to be clear, I mean try not to form expectations of any kind, either positive or negative, because expectations often limit your willingness to accept the outcome. Whatever the present moment is, it simply is, You don't have the choice to change what it is, but you do get to decide your attitude towards it by shifting the meaning you give to it. If you hold on to the idea that the future will be like the past, the future will appear to be like the past. This pertains mostly to negative expectations. With the positive expectations, it's a bit more nuanced. It is fine to expect that love will eventually win out. This is true. Whether it will win out on my timeline is a different story. Expecting it to is a barrier to grace, because your disappointment and frustration will arise when the love doesn't win out on your timeline. Right now might not be the time for love to win out, because the ego is still involved in the dialogue. Another unfair expectation that some of us put on ourselves is that we will show up perfectly in every interaction. Does nature work that way? No. It's perfectly imperfect. We're all susceptible to the ego and to emotions, and sometimes we will show up imperfectly. Some of those imperfections will turn into happy accidents, and some will not. If we continue to accept and love ourselves and others fully, regardless of that messiness, we will be less likely to compound mistakes by making huge impulsive adjustments without thoughtful consideration. Guilt and blame have no place in this solution. And guilt and blame over not being perfect is how a perfectly unreasonable expectation about ourselves usually gets resolved. As Sharon Van Etten said earlier, sometimes there will be moments of fear, moments of excitement, and moments of feeling stuck, none of which could be described as perfect feelings. But if we get in the habit of just witnessing these feelings rather than resisting them, we'll eventually accept them fully and find ourselves in flow with the life that is unfolding around us. The next question that came up in the Ecology of Communication dialogue was whether we are trapping ourselves and each other in our assessments of each other. So asking myself, do I trust this person's intentions, is a worthwhile question to ask. If the answer is no, then the self-inquiry must go on. Why don't I trust their intentions? Well, I judge them as having unsavory intentions. And what do I base this on? Do I know this for a fact? It might just be a story I'm telling myself. With only a partial view into their intentions, am I someone who is well positioned to judge their intentions? The intellectual honest answer would be no. So I might want to ask them about their intentions and listen to them using active listening, and then trust that they actually know better what their intentions are than I do. What ACIM explains about guilt is that when the ego gets its hands on guilt, quote, you project guilt to get rid of it, but you actually merely conceal it, end quote. If you register that you're feeling guilty the next time that you are, and begin to observe where your thoughts go from there, you will see it does happen as I'm describing. Usually our thoughts flip and flop back and forth from guilt to guilt to blame, endlessly until we catch it. It's an all too familiar roller coaster ride that we have a hard time getting off of if we don't see it for what it is. If you don't believe you're negotiating with a good faith actor, you'll become suspicious, becoming a less good faith actor yourself. The will to collaborate and understand each other disappears when the suspiciousness, and eventually the suspiciousness will result in viciousness, as you begin to see yourself as being attacked and choose to attack back. I don't think I need to explain further how this isn't going to work out well. It never has. According to A Course in Miracles, the Holy Spirit has its own solution for guilt, which is judging everyone as innocent, including myself. It's a position one can take, and I recommend it highly, because right away you begin to feel less fearful of the world. If you pay attention to the political discourse through this lens, you will see how we are constantly telling ourselves what the other side's intentions are, as if we really knew. Blame is non-constructive in that it leads to competition, not cooperation and collaboration. Entertaining guilty thoughts always leads to blame thoughts. We have free will, so we can decide for ourselves if people are good or evil. The road to hell is paved with good intentions only because those good intentions are consistently misconstrued by others. If you make this logical shift in your mindset, you will begin to make decisions from love instead of from fear. Pointing fingers isn't communication, it's the absence of communication. In communication, links are formed, while in blame, links are severed. The last piece of advice I heard from the YouTube video on the Ecology of Communication is simple. Don't take sides. Why? Well, it hasn't ever worked. We've been trying it that way for years, and it certainly hasn't created a lasting peace, just tragedy compounding tragedy. You're either with me or against me is a linear kind of mindset. There are no sides in the complex tapestry of interconnectedness that is life. They can't be defined. That is reality. We are imposing something unreal onto reality when we even consider the idea that sides are a thing. And through that framework, we will relate to discussions as having a false purpose, to convince the other person that you are right and they are wrong, rather than for finding some shared understanding by walking towards one another in the interest of lasting peace and understanding. Sometimes it appears that I'm not on your side. Here's an illustration of that. Represents a spectrum. It could be about an issue, like gun rights or abortion. It really doesn't matter. Now here's you, and here's the folks on the other side, and here's me. Now let's see what it looks like from your perspective. See, I get it. It certainly looks like I'm on their side. But I'm here in the middle, willing to talk with anyone, including you. Eliminating or canceling our enemies because they don't appear to agree with you entirely has proven itself not to work. That is, if it's a lasting peace you're seeking. And we're wrong in the first place in thinking that we have enemies, since the definition of insanity is trying the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. I'm proposing a more sane solution, something we haven't really tried, making creative communication a top priority in our culture. I think this stuff should be taught in kindergarten class, because we have to live with one another, and wouldn't it be better if we could learn how to get along by listening to each other better? Here's how it looks in politics. Except let's swap the left and the right. Here's what ends up happening sometimes. This is a more realistic view. It's pretty complex and not that easy to understand completely. Do you really need to try and find a side in all this? And what for? So I'm presenting all this information for the sake of advocating for and promoting a remedy to the situation where we find ourselves today, and to put some proposals on the table. We are in a moment of increased tension and chaos in the world. Also, I'd rather converse with you about it than lecture you. I hope to talk with anyone who wants to talk with me. These might be great ideas. They make a lot of sense to me, but they're far from all the great ideas out there. To access those, we need to include everyone in the conversation. I have tools like active listening that are absolutely necessary to nurture collaborative communication, and I would ask that we use that tool when we talk. I have a version of it called open-hearted listening, which I learned years ago from another couples counselor. It's a more heartfelt version of steel manning, which includes emotional validation, something that further aids constructive communication, because when emotions get validated, they clear out, and then we can start to talk about things with more clarity. Please feel free to leave a comment below, and if you want to have a private conversation, I'd be happy to set that up too. Let's talk about how we want to talk to one another. If you like the ideas expressed here, please like and subscribe and share it with friends as well. I believe with a very strong sense of conviction that if we begin to talk honestly about how we communicate and correct for some of the errors we find, it will aid us in getting through this crisis that we're all facing together, of a world that has much more uncertainty and instability than it has in a very long time. The author and political commentator David Brooks says it quite eloquently in talking about how we can save a relationship amid disagreement. He says, quote, "There are techniques and skills for disagreeing well, and even in brutalizing times, I think it's worth it to lead with trust and then figure out how to disagree well," end quote. And how do we cultivate that trust? By choosing to be uncompromising in seeing our brothers and sisters as the Christ they are, despite all appearances to the contrary. Those appearances are garden hoses that we are misperceiving as snakes. I'll leave you with a passage from A Course in Miracles. Quote, "The ego uses the body for attack, for pleasure, and for pride. The insanity of this perception makes it a fearful one. The Holy Spirit sees the body only as a means of communication, and because communication is sharing, it becomes communion. You might argue that fear as well as love can be communicated and therefore can be shared, but this is not so real as it sounds. Those who communicate fear are promoting attack, and attack always breaks communication, and therefore makes communion impossible. End quote. Thank you very much for your time.